All right, in this video, I want to talk about the theory of consequentialism, and more particularly one of its instantiations, so a specific form of consequentialism, utilitarianism. So in this video, we're going to outline the theory, talk about how utilitarianism comes out of consequentialism, what you have to add to consequentialism to get utilitarianism. We'll talk about two features of the view. Okay, so let's jump right in. Let's talk about, let me share my screen with y'all. Let's talk about first the theory of consequentialism. Here's the theory. You ought to do whatever maximizes net goodness in the world. This is an all-encompassing theory of your moral obligations. Every time you are in a situation where you have to decide what you morally ought to do, you should do whatever maximizes net goodness in the world. Whenever you have options of how to act, you ought to maximize net goodness in the world. What does that mean? Well, I'll tell you, and then we'll get more specific with it. In general, what it means is, regardless of who's affected by the action and how much goodness each person has, you're trying to get the highest amount. So you don't care as a consequentialist how that goodness is distributed. You care first and foremost about how much total goodness there is, right? So on analogy, if you're worried about your gross national or your gross domestic product, you're not worried about how that product is distributed among businesses. You're thinking about the total amount, right? So you're not thinking about when you think trying to get the highest GDP, you're not trying to get it distributed in a certain way. If it turns out that you get the highest GDP with Amazon having, making all the money, you don't care, right? You're trying for highest GDP. Similarly, consequentialists think that you ought to try to maximize net goodness in the world, regardless of how that goodness is distributed among people. It could be, and we'll see, it could be that is done by having inegalitarian outcomes, so unequal outcomes. For various reasons, that could be the case because people have different needs and situations. And it might be, as we'll talk in detail later, that to get the highest net goodness, you have very unequal amounts of goodness. Okay, so let's talk about one feature of consequentialism. It doesn't specify what things are good or bad. This is what's going to make room for utilitarianism as a specific form of consequentialism. It just says maximize net goodness. And if put in a variable for goodness, if X is good and Y is bad, what we're trying to do is maximize X and minimize Y. So you could think about what consequentialists would be committed to if they defined goodness in a certain way. And that's what's going to lead us to our next point. You get various forms of consequentialism by filling in the blanks of what's good and what's bad in various ways, right? So we've been talking some about various ways of defining what is good for a person, what's good, intrinsically good. And that's what this is short for. When I talk about what's good is blank and what's bad is blank, that's short for what's intrinsically good and what's intrinsically bad. So we've talked about a theory called hedonism, on which what's good is happiness. What's bad for a person is unhappiness. And particularly, truly, hedonists are those who define happiness as pleasure and the absence of pain. So if you think that what's intrinsically good is pleasure in the absence of pain, and you're also a consequentialist that says you ought to maximize goodness, net goodness, then what you get is you ought to maximize the net balance of pleasure over pain. Maximize pleasure in the world, basically. If, on the other hand, you think that happiness is what's good, intrinsically good, but you don't want to define it in terms of pleasure and pain necessarily, then but you're also a consequentialist, you'll say you ought to maximize net happiness in the world. And finally, Imagine a view on which what's good, intrinsically good, is getting your desires satisfied. That can come apart from happiness, right? Sometimes you get something you want, you're not happy. Sometimes you're happy without getting something you want. Well, if you had that view of well-being or of intrinsic goodness for a person, and you were also a consequentialist that said maximize net goodness, well, what clearly comes out is the view that you should maximize net desire satisfaction. And we've come up with names for all of these. Act utilitarianism is the one we'll be focusing on. That's the view that what's good is happiness, what's bad is unhappiness. That's intrinsically good and intrinsically bad. And therefore, if you're a consequentialist who endorses that view of the good, you come out with act utilitarianism. You ought to maximize net happiness in the world. So utilitarianism, I call it act utilitarianism here, but since it's the only view we're focusing on this week, I'm just going to shorten it and call it utilitarianism, just so we can have less of the word salad. Okay, so here's just that equation metaphor represented. So you get act utilitarianism by combining or adding together consequentialism with the claim that happiness is the only good. And similarly with the other views. We won't dwell on that. Here's a second feature, which seems really good initially, and which attracts a lot of people to utilitarianism. It's a feature of consequentialism as well, but we're talking about utilitarianism now as the specific kind of consequentialism that interests us. Utilitarianism is impartial. When you're deciding what to do, one person's happiness counts just as much as any other person's happiness. Okay, so I want to pause here. An actual concrete example. I think that's going to make things a lot easier. And I'll sit here and write it out with you so you can see. So we're going to assume utilitarianism is true, that we want to maximize net happiness. We're also going to make one more simplifying assumption. I say it's a simplifying assumption because it's not realistic. We can't do this in real life usually, or maybe even ever. But the assumption is this, that we can quantify happiness. Okay. Now, you may think, as I just said, that's not possible. Why are we assuming that? It's like assuming a frictionless plane when we're talking about basic physics. It helps us to learn certain things, even though there are no actual frictionless planes in the world. So what I'm going to assume is that we can quantify happiness with numbers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of this lecture. That assumption comes out false, but utilitarianism is not affected by it because they're going to still be able to compare levels of happiness without quantifying those levels of happiness. And I'll talk more about that. Okay, so let's assume that we have two people that would be affected by our action. Let's just call them John and Salim. And we have two actions that we could perform, Act 1 and Act 2. Well, we won't say for now what those actions are. We're going to try to keep it a little general, Now, let's say that John, if I perform Act 1, so I'm the one performing the act, and it's John and Salim who are going to be affected by the act, but I have these two acts to choose from. This is, again, let me pause for just 1 second, both simplifying assumptions, pretty much, because usually you have more than two acts open to you. Right now, I could continue talking. I could stop talking and look awkwardly into the camera. I could walk outside and do cartwheels. I could go outside and try to do a rain dance. I mean, there's a ton of things I could do. But we're going to constrain it to two options, just for simplicity. And we're going to constrain it to two people that the action could affect, even though usually your action could affect more than two people. Well, I don't know about usually, but lots of times. But we're constraining it to make it a simple case. So let's say that John would get 10 units of happiness from action 1. So suppose we're assuming I pick action 1. Salim is not as benefited by action 1. He gets just 1 unit of happiness. Still a pretty good action, right? I'm making two people happier than they otherwise would have been. Action 2, though, it's more evenly distributed. John gets some happiness, just not as much as he would from action 1. Salim gets more happiness from action 2 than from action 1. So just to summarize again, I can choose between doing one of two things. On the first one, John gets 10 units of happiness, Salim gets 1. On the second one, John gets 5 and Salim gets 5. Now, question, you can pause here if you want, and I encourage you to do so. You're really not learning until you're actively engaged in learning. So, excuse me. Sorry about that. So pause here and see if you can answer this question. Which of the two actions will the utilitarian say you ought to pick? So pause now. Okay, if you paused, we're back now. I wonder what your answers were. A lot of people are going to say Act 2. And the reason they're going to say Act 2 is because that's what they think you should do. And the reason is because it's more fair, right? If you're trying to divvy up some cake between your two kids and you can give one of them way more and make that kid happier and at the expense of the other kid, you shouldn't do that. You should split it in half. It's more fair. Give them equal amounts of happiness, assuming that they're going to be made happy in equal amounts by the same amount of cake. But the utilitarian is going to say that you ought to actually pick Act 1. See if I can even highlight that. It's Act 1. That's the correct answer. And why? Because again, they're not concerned with how the happiness is distributed among the people affected by the action. They're concerned with the greatest total amount of happiness. So that means what you do, if you're going to draw it up in a matrix like this, is add up in each column the amount of happiness resulting from that action. In this case, we can even get down here and do this. We get 11 units here, nope, and only 10 units here. I'm putting the positive there because sometimes you can create negative happiness if your action is going to cause unhappiness on the whole. That's not true with either of these actions, but it can happen, and we'll look at a case where it does happen. So clearly, it's just basic arithmetic at this point. 11 is bigger than 10, so that is the action you should pick. Creates more total happiness. Okay, so that's a concrete example. Now here's the thing. I was just talking, we can go switch over here, about the impartiality of utilitarianism. And what that means essentially in concrete terms is if you switch John and Salim here, that Salim is actually the person who benefits more from Act 1, and John is actually the person who benefits less, and then the utilitarian does not care because it did not change these numbers down here. It doesn't matter who gets what amount of happiness. And that's a good thing. There's no favoritism for particular individuals. There's no favoritism from people from a certain political background or sex or gender or whatever, sexual orientation, whatever. Doesn't matter as long as your action produces the most happiness, right? So put in here that, Salim is black and gay or something like that. And again, doesn't change anything. Put in here that John is white and liberal. It doesn't matter, right? All that matters, it might matter if those things affected how much happiness was produced. But that's the only way it could matter. And even then it only indirectly matters, right? So maybe white liberals aren't made as happy by things in general, but that would only matter if it changed this number. And we're assuming that it doesn't. So just changing demographic details or who the person is or how they're connected to the person making the decision. And we'll talk more about that too, because even if they are closely related to you or your child or something, it shouldn't make a difference on utilitarianism. So there's no favoritism, there's no partiality. Now, we'll see later in later videos that can be a two-edged sword, because on the one hand, it seemed good when I highlighted all the ways that it didn't allow for these bad forms of discrimination, but we're also going to see how in some cases partiality is appropriate. But we'll hold on to that for the videos where we're considering objections to utilitarianism. Okay, so that's the second feature. Seemed like a positive feature in general. Hold off on, the objections, but seemed positive. It's a good feature. And on the whole, like, who could object to trying to do the most amount of good, and in this case, trying to create the most amount of happiness? You might think, I'm just trying to highlight the plausibility of the view before we consider objections to it. Think if you're in government, right? This is a much closer to the right way of deliberating when you're in government. We consider someone a good politician, a good legislator, if they have the interest and the happiness of the general populace in mind, rather than if they are catering to a special interest, right? It's because this person gave me money that I'm writing this law. It benefits them. It's actually to the detriment of most people in general. It actually does not create the most amount of happiness for that reason. That's a bad legislator. It's a bad politician. That's not how they should deliberate. Okay. I've talked about that. I'm sorry. So now the last thing I want to cover in this video is this. I think I've covered the basics of consequentialism, the basics of utilitarianism. I gave you a concrete example. We can work through more examples like that. We probably will, especially in the objection videos. And when we get to the objection videos, if you're unclear now on what utilitarianism is all about, it might get clearer when we consider objections. But that's the view. Maximize net happiness. We saw how it doesn't depend on how the happiness is distributed necessarily. Or they don't, let me say this, utilitarians don't care at all about how the happiness is distributed as long as they get the most total happiness from the action. That's the thing you ought to do. Okay, let me pause for a second. And we're going to consider one little wrinkle because I want to show you one way that utilitarians disagree amongst themselves. So again, this is, you're not going to have participation assignments in this video. But what I want you to do is, for your own understanding, try to complete this task. So pause the video and try to come up with a case in which you have a really good reason to expect some action to result in the best possible consequences, but it unexpectedly has horrible consequences. So pause now if you want to do that. Now, if you did, let's assume that you do the thing that if you're a utilitarian, what you're going to do is you're going to do the thing that you have reason to expect will result in the best possible consequences. Now, it actually has really horrible consequences. And this leads us to a question. Let me put a concrete case on the table, just so we have a concrete case to talk. So you see someone bullying someone else, right? I've actually encountered this a few times out on the street and had to think about whether I should call somebody or whether I should step in myself. Something in the case I'm thinking of, it was a man and some woman that he was involved with, I assume. You think I shouldn't, here's what you can be sure of. Probably the best thing to do is not to do nothing. Let's assume it actually has in this case, as it hadn't in my case, but it has in this case, proceeded to a physical altercation where, let's say the woman is outmatched, hasn't done anything, is not threatening the guy, but he, has advanced to a physical altercation. He's beating her up. And, the thing to, you should not expect doing nothing to have the best consequences. What should you do? Well, let's say that, you decide, well, I should call somebody. So you call the cops, they come over there. And the reason you think that that's going to have the best consequences is because it's going to save this woman from physical harm now and maybe in the future, because now once it gets in the system, then maybe the situation can be monitored better. She can be pointed towards some resources for help or something like this. But then it turns out unexpectedly, very unexpectedly, when the cops show up, the woman has something happens in her head kind of irrationally, and she thinks she's in trouble. So she starts to run and she slips and falls and hits her head. And let's say she dies. I'm getting morbid here. Now, your action resulted in that. So your action resulted in the worst consequences because let's say, it seemed like you didn't have any reason to think. It wasn't a brutal beating, right? You had no reason to think that she was going to die if you didn't call the cops. And so, but as it turned out, in this case, let's just make it simple and assume that you had two options, not calling the cops or calling the cops. So doing nothing or calling the cops. Turns out that as it actually played out, doing nothing would have been better. So it would have produced better net consequences, more net happiness, because she wouldn't have died in that case. But you actually had reason to think that the thing that would produce the best consequences was calling the cops. So that's why you did it. So there's a question here. Is the utilitarian saying you ought to do what you reasonably expect to have the best consequences, or you ought to do what actually has the best consequences? This sort of example is where those two camps are actually going to split, because if what you ought to do is what you reasonably expect to have the best consequences, then you did the right thing in calling the cops. But if what you ought to do is what actually has the best consequences, you did the wrong thing, because you did the thing that has the worst consequences of the two options, right? So this is where utilitarians split. They disagree about what you actually ought to do, whether it's important that you do the thing with the actual best consequences, which you often can't know ahead of time, or the thing with the reasonably expected best consequences. So some say you ought to do whatever is most reasonable to suppose will result in the highest net happiness, and others say you ought to do whatever actually results in the highest net happiness. So that's just one disagreement among utilitarians. Some say the first and some say the second. Now you might wonder, how can you endorse the second? Because surely what you ought to do is somehow constrained by the information you have, right? Like I can't have an obligation to do something that I not only don't know about, but have no access to information. Like it would be unreasonable to expect me to know about it, right? So suppose, as is probably true, there's a kid, with a name and an age and an identity that's going to die in the next hour, within, let's say 200 miles of me. Okay. Well, let's say 60 miles of me. I don't know the odds on that. But if it were true, there's a kid, let's say in Granbury, let's say that's actually true. And I could save him by driving over there. He's going to drown or something. I don't know. Man, this is a dark lecture. I'm sorry about that. So let's say that. Now, I could save him. It seems like, given what else I'm going to do today, that's the thing that would produce the best consequences. Problem is, I have no way of knowing. Even if it's true that that's going to happen, that he's going to die in a drowning accident within an hour, I have no way of knowing about it. It would be unreasonable to expect me to know about it. So how could I have an obligation to do it, even though it will produce the actual highest net happiness by saving him? So you might think. And I think that's a reasonable thought. I think it's reasonable to say, like, surely it's the first claim here on this page that is actually the best form of utilitarianism. The actual results utilitarians, as we'll call them, as opposed to the expected results utilitarians, they have some things they can say. They'll say something like this, and again, this is getting down into the weeds, and if this is just, if your level of what you can take in terms of comprehension is met, then you can forget about this. But if you're interested, what they'll say is, well, we should have different standards for what constitutes the rightness and wrongness of an action versus the blameworthiness. So they'll say, I'm going to tell you what it actually is to do the right thing or the wrong thing. And that's the thing that actually results in the highest net happiness. But that doesn't mean I have to say that you're blameworthy for doing the wrong thing. You could blamelessly do the wrong thing, because blameworthiness, they'll say, is relative to what you can reasonably know or expect, whereas actual rightness or wrongness is not. Now, that's the line they take. It's unclear whether that works. We'd have to talk a lot more about it and read a lot of complicated stuff. Okay, but that's where we'll end for now.